The capital city of Upper Canada looted and burned. A key fort on the Niagara Peninsula captured by the Americans. A counteroffensive at the other end of Lake Ontario failed. After 8 months of failures at the outset of the war for the Americans, now they were gaining an upper hand in the War of 1812. The efforts of one woman, though, would change the fortunes for the British, at least on the Niagara Peninsula. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. The spring of 1813 was one filled with hard times for the British and Canadian forces in Upper Canada. The looting of York and the capture of Fort George were a hit to the morale of the troops and the populace. The Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada was turfed for his conduct during the Battle of York when he chose to withdraw with the British regulars, leaving the local militia to fend for themselves. There was a bright spot for the British, though. Stony Creek would see a daring nighttime attack scatter the American forces, ending the pursuit of the British troops who were pulling back west along the southern shore of Lake Ontario. The Americans would also have to pull back because of another development, a British counterattack into American territory. This attack came about shortly after the arrival of Captain James Lucas Yeo. He had been appointed in command of the British Navy on the Great Lakes. He stopped first in Quebec, then headed down the St. Lawrence to Kingston, where he met up with Governor General George Prevost. Prevost was already traveling from Quebec to York to handle the job of replacing Major General Henry Sheaffe as Lieutenant Governor for Upper Canada. Both men arrived in Kingston on May 15th and inspected the forces, land and naval, that were there. Yeo also oversaw the completion of the refitting of a number of vessels, as well as calling for the hurried completion of the sloop of war Wolfe, named after James Wolfe, the commanding officer for the Battle of Quebec in 1759. While they were in Kingston handling business, word came in about the attack on Fort George. As disheartening as it was to learn about the loss of Fort George, it meant something else. The Americans had their fleet on Lake Ontario at the mouth of the Niagara, at the other end of the lake. The British had ships at their disposal right across the mouth of the St. Lawrence from the American base of operations for the lake, and that base had little in the way of defenses. Sackets Harbor was founded as a port to be used for trade between upstate New York and Kingston in 1801. It was one of the most prominent communities in the area and was the main shipyard for the Americans on the Great Lakes. Its capture would all but eliminate the American naval presence on Lake Ontario and give the British and Canadians another foothold on American soil, this one at the opposite end of the border from Detroit. On May 27, 1813, a force commanded by Prevost himself left from Kingston, destined for Sackets Harbor. The troops at the disposal of the British included men from the 100th Regiment, the 9th King's Regiment of Foot, the 104th Regiment, the Glengarry Light Infantry, and the Royal Artillery. This force, along with a number of irregular troops, arrived off the shores of Sackets Harbor the morning of the 28th. The landing started just before noon, but then sails were seen in the distance. This set off a panic for the British. Was their intelligence faulty? Was the dispatch from Fort George wrong? Had Admiral Chauncey returned to Sackets Harbor? If this was the case, the landing would need to be called off. Several small boats transporting troops would be no match for actual warships, as no escort accompanied them. Then, it became apparent the sails weren't warships. Instead, it was around a dozen smaller boats carrying men from Oswego to Sackets Harbor. Some of the indigenous irregulars, supported by a small gunship, forced these boats to land at Stony Point, where the Americans fled into the woods. The irregulars followed. After 30 minutes, 35 Americans lay dead. Another 115 who were on the boats surrendered. Just 7 men made it out from the woods on the American side after that engagement, and they would proceed on foot to Sackets Harbor. These men would let the base know the British were coming. Combined with the delay after the interception, this gave enough notice to the Americans to prepare the defenses against an oncoming attack. The Americans had 400 regular soldiers and 750 militia at Sackets Harbor, as well as 2 schooners. These men set about to get ready for an attack, and they covered nearly every option available to the British, including putting a force on Horse Island in case that was where the landing took place. And this move would be the smart one, as on the morning of the 29th, the British landed on the island south of Sackets Harbor itself, joined by a small causeway. The militiamen from Albany who were there put up a staunch resistance, but were outnumbered and outclassed. They were up against British regulars. The British would break the defense, forcing them to flee. The landing force would get organized and prepare for the assault, marching over the causeway and then heading to their left towards Sacket Harbor, attacking from the land as opposed to trying a landing under fire while closer to the town. The regulars, though, were the ones who were defending the town, not the militia. It would be a stiff defense with the initial charges by the British repulsed. Things appeared to be at a stalemate. On the lake, the British failed to get their ships to train the few guns that they had on the town for support. Finally, one ship, the HMS Beresford, trained its guns on a battery at Fort Tompkins, just outside the town, that was firing on the British landing force. It appeared that the British would have a chance to try again, this time without having to deal with artillery fire. The previous failures that morning, though, had shaken the confidence of Prevost. He called for a withdrawal after deciding himself that there wasn't going to be any success in the attempt to capture the American base. Writing after the battle, Prevost wrote the complete opposite of what had happened. He wrote the British landed, soundly beat the Americans, but it wasn't practical to hold the town, so a tactical retreat was called. And this retreat was handled perfectly and orderly, and there were no problems whatsoever. The words of the men who were fighting in the battle differed. Those accounts called the situation as the British tried to get back onto their boats as utter chaos. The whole situation was so poorly handled, a few of the officers and most of the men had no problem saying the cause of the defeat was the incompetence of Prevost. In the frenetic action the morning of May 29th, 1 officer and 47 men were killed on the British side. Another 12 officers and 83 soldiers were wounded. 3 officers and 13 infantrymen would be left behind in the chaos. For the Americans, the casualty reports showed 22 men were killed and 84 wounded, with 26 reported as missing in action. Word about the attack at Sackets Harbor reached Admiral Chauncey at the other end of the lake, and his force would pull back to defend Sackets Harbor. This also left the American soldiers on the southwestern shore of Lake Ontario without any support, and they pulled back to Forts George and Niagara. When we look at the Niagara Peninsula today, we see one of the premier tourist attractions in North America, if not the world, partly due to Niagara Falls and Horseshoe Falls. Far and few are the reminders, aside from historical markers and historical sites, that this was one of the key battlegrounds in the War of 1812. It would see battles, skirmishes, massacres, and atrocities. These historical sites are also popular tourist attractions, don't get me wrong. The one in Queenston Heights receives thousands of visitors every year, and another one in Thorold, Ontario receives quite a few visitors as well. It is the site of the Battle of Beaver Dams. In June of 1813, after the majority of the British troops at Fort George had fallen back to Burlington Heights, there was an outpost left at Beaver Dams. And this outpost was in a central location for the British to be able to make sorties out that would harass the Americans in the region, keeping them relatively tied up in Fort George. The raids, though, did raise the ire of the officer who commanded the American forces in the region, Brigadier General John Parker Boyd. He was determined to do something about this British presence in the area and took a force of men out. They traveled south along the Niagara River to Queenston, where they billeted in the homes of the residents. It is a little ironic that the Americans would billet themselves in the homes of the residents of Queenston. Part of the anger of the 13 colonies before the American Revolution was the billeting of British soldiers in the homes of the colonists. When this billeting happened, the residents were expected to pay for the upkeep of the soldiers. The Americans were so against the practice of billeting that they outright made it unconstitutional. The Third Amendment of the U.S. Constitution reads, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in times of war, but in a manner prescribed by law." This is interpreted as meaning that if billeting is needed, laws need to be passed to allow it. Of course, that was only when billeting in the homes of American citizens. The people of Upper Canada weren't American citizens. But considering some of the American politicians of the time wanted Upper Canada to be annexed as part of the war, it would make sense to afford them the same rights that the citizens of the U.S. were entitled to. Now, the American officers opted to set up in the home of militia captain James Secord. The officers had set out first and arrived in the town a few days ahead of the rest of the force. While there in the Secord home, the officers didn't care about who heard what they said, nor did they feel that anyone would be able to do anything about what they said. They talked openly about all of their plans, and this is where one of the most well-known legends of Canadian history comes into the picture. So, who is Laura Secord? We'll go back to the beginning. Laura was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1775. Her family, the Ingersolls, had first come to North America in 1629. They were a well-established and well-known family. During the American Revolution, when Laura was just an infant, her father fought on the side of the colonies. Once the war was over, though, he was upset with how loyalists were treated. He would meet with Mohawk leader Joseph Brant in 1793, and Brant offered to help the Ingersolls move to Upper Canada. The family would make the move, stopping first in Queenston, where Laura's father ran the tavern. From there, they would move to the Thames Valley with a land grant of 60,000 acres. That would eventually develop into the town of Ingersoll, Ontario, between Woodstock and London. While the Ingersolls were in Queenston, Laura would meet the man who would become her husband, James Secord. They would marry in 1797, and she remained in Queenston while the family went off to the west. During the Battle of Queenston Heights, James would be wounded serving in the 1st Lincoln Militia. He was convalescing at home when the Americans took Fort George, and in an effort to suppress any partisan activity, took men of military age from the Queenston area to the United States as prisoners. James Secord was not taken, though, due to his health. This is part of why his home in particular was selected for billeting. That's the quick version of who Laura Secord is. As you can tell, she was not a chocolatier when the events of the War of 1812 took place, nor was she one after the war either. We'll talk later in this episode about how her name is synonymous with delicious treats. On the night of June 21st, 1813, the American officers were in the Secord home talking about plans for an attack on the British outpost at Beaver Dams. From Queenston, it would be a 12-kilometer march, easily covered in a short time span. Laura heard all of the plans and resolved to head out the next day to inform the commander of the men at Beaver Dams, Lieutenant James Fitzgibbons. She would set out covering 20 kilometers on foot. She went from Queenston west to St. David's, then up to Homer, across to Shipman's Corners, before meeting with Fitzgibbons and the British near Short Hills. We are fortunate enough to recount the story using the words of Secord herself as she recounted the journey at the age of 85 to the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, when he visited Canada in 1860. In doing so, I found I should have great difficulty in getting through the American Guards, which were out 10 miles in the country. Determined to persevere, however, I left early in the morning, walked 19 miles in the month of June over a rough and difficult part of the country. When I came to a field belonging to Mr. DeQ in the neighborhood of the Beaver Dam, by this time daylight had left me. Here I found all the Indians encamped. By moonlight, the scene was terrifying, and to those accustomed to such scenes, might be considered grand. Upon advancing to the Indians, they all rose and with some yells said, "Woman," which made me tremble. I cannot express the awful feeling it gave me, but I did not lose my presence of mind. I was determined to persevere. I went up to one of the chiefs, made him understand that I had great news for Captain Fitzgibbon, and that he must let me pass to his camp, or that he and his party would all be taken. The chief at first objected to let me pass, but finally consented, after some hesitation, to go with me and accompany me to Fitzgibbon's station, which was at the Beaver Dam, where I had an interview with him. The details provided to Fitzgibbon by Laura Secord confirmed suspicions that were already being held by the officer and the indigenous irregulars attached to his force. The Americans were planning an attack, and soon. With 400 irregulars in the camp and 43 British regulars, the Mohawk offered to take point and set up along the most obvious route for the Americans to take, along the top of the escarpment as it wound through the area. They would set up and wait. The Americans left Queenston on the morning of June 24th, headed for the British camp. They would take the path anticipated by the Mohawk, and when they got to the top, they quickly realized their predicament. They were surrounded. A brief firefight would ensue, with a white flag quickly going up from the Americans. Under the flag of truce, Fitzgibbon approached the officer leading the group, Colonel Charles Borsler. The British officer would embellish the situation, telling the Americans they were vastly outnumbered, and the indigenous warriors were looking for a fight, and if the battle were to resume, he wouldn't be able to contain their bloodlust. Fitzgibbon's description of the situation, in his own words: "With respect to the affair with Captain Borsler, not a shot was fired on our side by any but the Indians. They beat the American detachment into a state of terror, and the only share I claim is taking advantage of a favorable moment to offer them protection from the tomahawk and scalping knife. The Indian Department did the rest." The Americans quickly surrendered and were taken prisoner. The day had started with 587 Americans looking to ambush a group of 446 at the British camp. It ended with 512 American prisoners, with 25 killed during the fighting and another 50 wounded. On the British side, all of the casualties were among the Mohawk, with 5 killed and 25 wounded. The role Laura Secord played in the Battle of Beaver Dams has been oft debated in Canada, including whether she actually made the trek and how she learned the American plans. Fitzgibbon himself did write about how Secord was involved in the situation in 1827. "I do hereby certify that on the 22nd day of June 1813, Mrs. Secord, wife of James Secord, Esquire, then of St. David's, came to me at the Beaver Dam after sunset, having come from her house at St. David's by a circuitous route, a distance of 12 miles, and informed me that her husband had learned from an American officer the preceding night that a detachment from the American army then in Fort George would be sent out on the following morning for the purpose of surprising and capturing a detachment of the 49th Regiment then at Beaver Dam under my command. In consequence of this information, I placed the Indians under Norton together with my own detachment in a situation to intercept the American detachment, and we occupied it during the night of the 22nd, but the enemy did not come until the morning of the 24th, when his detachment was captured. Colonel Borsler, their commander, in a conversation with me, confirmed fully the information communicated to me by Mrs. Secord, and accounted for the attempt not having been made on the 23rd, as at first intended. John Norton, the man in command of the Mohawk irregulars that were at the front of the battle, wrote himself that a loyal inhabitant of the region was the one who provided them with the information needed to ambush the ambushers, but no name was mentioned. It was pretty apparent Secord did make the trip, and the tale is not just a legend. But how did she come to learn the information? Famed Canadian historian Pierre Burton noted Secord herself never provided a consistent answer as to how she learned the information. At first, she told Fitzgibbon her husband was the one who found out, passing the information on to her to take to the British encampment. However, Secord had also told others she overheard the Americans making the plans while she was in the kitchen and they were eating dinner. There has also been some speculation, with no credible evidence to give the theory any real credence, that Secord learned the American plans as she was having an affair with one of the American officers, and the inconsistencies in her story are due to her not wanting to admit what happened. No matter how she found out, though, she did, and she then made the trip and then helped the British from being ambushed. After the war, Secord would go on to have 2 more children. She had a total of 7. The family would have some financial difficulties after the war, but James was then appointed the customs collector at Chippewa. When James passed away in 1844, it left Laura destitute. She had to sell much of her land, and she was denied the inheritance of his pension after his passing. After her heroics during the war, she was ignored, receiving no acknowledgement in her lifetime aside from the reports filed by Fitzgibbon and the meeting with the Prince of Wales. She would pass away in 1868 at the age of 93, and she is buried beside her husband in Niagara Falls. Now, how did Laura Secord become associated with chocolates here in Canada? In 1913, Frank P. O'Connor started a company in Toronto called the Laura Secord Candy Store. He named it after the heroine of the War of 1812, 100 years after her journey on foot through the wilderness to warn the British. Today, there are over 100 retail outlets across Canada. I can honestly say pretty much every dollar spent there is well worth it. So if anyone from their offices happen to be watching this, we really like your chocolate. Our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we'll focus on one of the battles for the control of the Great Lakes between the most powerful navy in the world and the United States Navy. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.